Westeros had survived mad kings, dragons, and war. But that night, something far worse arrived. The sky above the Kingswood tore open without warning. There was no thunder to announce it, no storm clouds gathering to give men time to run. One moment the night was ordinary cold, clear, stars scattered like salt across black velvet, and the next, a seam of light split the heavens in perfect silence. It did not roar. It did not burn the clouds away. It simply opened, the way a curtain opens onto a room no one was meant to see. And from that seam, figures began to fall. The hunting party that witnessed it would later swear, before septons and maesters alike, that the figures did not fall so much as arrive already standing, already whole, boots settling onto the forest floor as though they had always been there, and the world had simply forgotten to notice them until now. There were 11 of them, though no two men who survived that night could agree on the exact number. Pale coats, unfamiliar in cut and cloth, marked with strange crosses of blue light that pulsed faintly like something breathing beneath the fabric. At the center of them stood a man who looked, to every terrified eye in that clearing, entirely unremarkable brown hair, a calm, faintly pleasant expression, hands clasped behind his back, as though he had stepped out for an evening stroll rather than torn a hole through the fabric of reality itself. "Interesting," the man said, and his voice carried across the clearing without him raising it at all, the way a lord's voice carries in a hall built to hold it. "So this is where the current has taken us." One of the hunters, a boy of 16 named Perrin, who would tell this story for the rest of his life, found the courage or the foolishness to speak first. Who are you?" His hand had gone to the knife at his belt, though even as he drew it, some part of him understood how useless it would be. The brown-haired man turned toward him with mild, almost kind interest, the way a man might turn toward a child asking an earnest question. "A fair question, and one I confess I do not have a complete answer to myself." "Not yet." He glanced up at the sky, where the seam of light was already closing, folding shut like a wound healing far too quickly. "We were soul reapers, once, in the place we came from, guardians of the dead, if that means anything to you. And before that, we were other things still." Beside him, a woman with pale skin and dark hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it stepped forward, examining her own gloved hands with detached curiosity. Blue light traced faint lines along her wrist, like veins made of captured lightning. "Aizen-sama," she said. "The resonance in this world is different. I don't sense the same spiritual currents. No hollows, no reishi, not as we knew it. And yet my bow still answers." She flexed her fingers, and a bow of pale light folded into existence in her palm, humming faintly. "Curious," said Aizen, and the word seemed to please him more than trouble him. "It appears our nature has changed along with our surroundings. We arrived as Quincy. It seems bow and blue fire in place of blade and bankai. A demotion, some might call it. I prefer to think of it as an opportunity to learn a new shape before we decide what to build with it." Around the clearing, the others were beginning to take stock of themselves in the same manner, testing weight, testing balance, watching threads of blue spiritual energy gather and dissolve at their fingertips like something being relearned rather than lost. A tall man, with an eye patch and an unsettling grin, flexed his hand and laughed low in his throat, delighted by the unfamiliar hum of power coursing through unfamiliar limbs. A woman with green hair examined a blade at her hip that was no longer quite a sword, murmuring something about how interesting it was that instinct alone still knew how to hold it. Perrin did not wait to hear more. He ran, crashing through the underbrush with the others, and none of the strange figures moved to stop them. Should we pursue them, Aizen-sama? The pale-skinned woman asked, watching the hunters flee. They will spread word of us before we understand where we are. Let them, Aizen said, and there was no urgency in it at all. Word is precisely what I want spread. Rumor is a far gentler teacher than open war, Harrible. Let this world learn our names slowly, the way one learns to fear a storm from the sound of distant thunder, long before the rain arrives. He looked around at the dark trees, at a forest that belonged to no world he recognized, and something almost like satisfaction crossed his face. We have all the time we need. Let's begin by learning exactly whose kingdom we've fallen into. The rumors reached King's Landing within 3 days. The way rumors of anything strange in the Kingswood always did, mangled, exaggerated, and impossible to verify, which made them spread all the faster. A hunting party had seen demons fall from a tear in the sky. No, not demons. Pale knights. Armored in light instead of steel. No, they weren't armored at all. They wore robes, and they carried bows that burned blue instead of loosing arrows. Whatever the details. Every version agreed on one thing. Something had arrived in the Kingswood that did not belong to this world, and it had let a party of frightened hunters simply walk away. In the Red Keep, the small council took the reports with the weary skepticism such reports usually earned. Drunk woodsmen and superstitious peasants had seen stranger things after a bad harvest and a worse ale. But when 3 more sightings arrived from villages a day's ride apart, each describing the same pale coats and the same calm, unhurried men who asked quiet questions of frightened small folk and then simply vanished in flashes of blue light too fast for the eye to track, even the most skeptical lords began to grow uneasy. It was Lord Varys who took the reports most seriously, though he said little of his reasoning aloud. He had survived long enough in the Game of Thrones by trusting patterns over panic, and the pattern here troubled him more than any single account. They are not raiding, he noted in the letters he sent north, south, and across the narrow sea. They are not burning villages or taking captives. They are watching, and whoever sends scouts before soldiers is planning something larger than a raid. 200 leagues north, in the solar at Winterfell, a raven arrived bearing much the same account, and Lord Eddard Stark read it twice before setting it down. Strangers falling from a tear in the sky, he said to Catelyn, not quite believing his own words as he spoke them. Robes of light, bows without arrows. It reads like a mummer's tale. Mummer's tales don't reach 3 separate villages independently, each telling the same story, Catelyn said. She had never been a woman inclined toward fear without cause, which was precisely why the unease in her voice troubled Ned more than the report itself. What if it's true, Ned? What if something has come that none of us understand? Ned did not answer at once. He looked instead toward the window, toward the gray northern sky, and thought, though he did not say it aloud, of older stories his father had told him as a boy, stories of things that came from beyond the world men knew, in the long dark ages before the 7 kingdoms had names at all. Then we watch, he said finally, and we wait for it to show itself fully before we decide whether it's an enemy. He did not yet know that far to the north, beyond the wall, something ancient and patient had already begun to stir because it, too, had felt the tear in the world open, and it recognized, in some cold and wordless way, that a new kind of death had entered its domain. The first true confrontation happened not by Aizen's design, but by the carelessness of men who did not yet understand what they had stumbled upon. A company of Kingswood outlaws, broken men, and deserters who preyed on travelers along the forest roads found 4 of the strangers camped in a clearing at dusk. A towering man with unsettling white hair and a permanent grin the small folk had already begun calling the Wolf in their fearful retellings. A smaller, quieter man with glasses who spoke rarely and watched everything. the green-haired woman with the strange, not quite sword, and a boy with unnervingly wide eyes who seemed younger than the rest, but carried himself with a stillness none of the outlaws could name. The outlaws, 40 strong and confident in their numbers, saw only 4 travelers and an opportunity. Your coin, your blades, and maybe we let you keep your boots, their leader called out, stepping into the clearing with the easy swagger of a man who had done this 100 times and never once lost. The white-haired man Grimjoe, though the outlaws would never learn his name before the fight ended, turned toward him with an expression of open, delighted disbelief, as though he'd just been told a joke too absurd not to laugh at. Coin, he repeated, tasting the word. You hear that, Okwara? 40 rag, wearing bandits think we're carrying coin. Do not provoke them needlessly, the quiet man Okwara said, without looking up from where he sat. Aizen, Sama instructed restraint. Restraints for people who need it. Grimjow rolled his shoulders, and blue light gathered at his fingertips like something eager to be let loose. I've been holding a bow instead of a blade for 3 days, and I still don't know if I hate it. Let's find out what it does. What followed lasted 4 seconds. The outlaw leader would later be found, those few of his company who survived to be found at all, pinned to a tree trunk by a spear of blue light that had passed clean through his shoulder without so much as scorching the bark behind him, alive only because Grimjoe had, in a rare moment of restraint, aimed to wound rather than kill. Around him, more than a dozen of his men lay scattered across the clearing, some merely stunned, others bearing wounds too clean and too strange for any blade the maesters had ever treated. Blue-white light still crackled faintly along the edges of several wounds, as though the injuries themselves were something more than physical. The survivors fled in every direction, and this time no one moved to stop their flight either. You were told restraint, Okwara said again, unmoved by the carnage. That was restraint, Grimjoe said, grinning at the scattered wreckage of 40 armed men. You should see what I do without it. By the time the tale reached King's Landing a week later, it had grown a new and unmistakable weight to it. Not the fearful exaggeration of frightened hunters this time, but the grim, verified report of the few outlaws who'd survived, corroborated by a maester sent to examine the wounded. No blade did this, the maester's letter read. No arrow either. Something burned through flesh and bone alike, and yet cauterized the wounds so cleanly the men should be dead of shock, and are not. I do not have the knowledge to explain what I have seen, and I do not say that lightly. In his solar in the Red Keep, Lord Varys read the report 3 times, and finally allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something close to genuine fear. Whoever leads them is being careful, he wrote in his next dispatch. They wound where they could kill. They watch where they could conquer. This is not the behavior of raiders, nor of an invading army eager for war. This is the behavior of a man laying groundwork, and I have played this game long enough to recognize the shape of it, even from an opponent I do not understand at all. Aizen did not announce himself to King's Landing with fire or force. He arrived 3 weeks after the tear in the sky, as a guest. No one could later explain quite how he had entered the Red Keep unannounced, past guards who swore under oath, and later under considerably less gentle questioning that no one had passed their posts. He simply appeared, one evening, standing at the edge of a feast already in progress, dressed now in clothing that could have passed, at a careless glance, for the fine robes of a foreign lord. Dark, understated, cut in a style no herald could place to any known house or kingdom. Forgive the intrusion, he said, and his voice found every corner of the hall without effort, silencing conversation the way a cold draft silences a room. I felt it only proper to introduce myself, rather than let rumor continue to do it so poorly on my behalf. Guards moved. Steel was drawn. And Aizen simply stood there, hands folded, entirely unbothered, until the small council itself, summoned in a panic, arrived to find a foreign stranger seated calmly at the edge of the high table as though he had been invited from the start. "I am called Aizen," he said, to the assembled lords who did not yet know whether to treat him as an assassin, an emissary, or something they had no name for at all. "I lead the travelers your kingdom has no doubt heard rumors of by now. I understand the fear those rumors have caused, and I regret it genuinely. It was never my intention to frighten your small folk, only to understand quietly what manner of world we had arrived in before making our presence more widely known. And now you've made it known," said a lord near the table, voice tight with barely restrained alarm. "Why show yourself now, and not before?" "Because rumor left unchecked breeds fear, and fear breeds violence, as your Kingswood outlaws recently, and regrettably, demonstrated." Aizen's expression did not so much as flicker at the memory of the bloodshed. "I would rather begin this relationship with honesty than let it fester into something neither of us wants. I have no interest in conquest, my lords. I have interest only in understanding, and perhaps in time, in offering what assistance I can. My companions and I possess abilities, let us say, that your world does not currently have names for. Abilities that might prove useful against threats your maesters have long dismissed as children's stories." The words landed with deliberate weight, and Aizen watched them land with the patient satisfaction of a man who had planted a seed exactly where he intended it to grow. He did not mention the Night King by name. He did not need to, not yet. He had learned enough in 3 quiet weeks of listening at village fires and reading captured fragments of Septon's tales to know that somewhere beyond a wall of ice in the far north, this world kept its oldest fears locked away and mostly forgotten. He would let that fear ripen in its own time. For now, it was enough to be seen reasonable, calm, and unthreatening, while the true shape of his intentions remained folded quietly out of sight, the way a blade stays hidden inside a sheath that looks, to the untrained eye, like nothing more than fine leather. "What do you want from us?" the lord pressed, unconvinced. Aizen smiled. And it was, to every person in that hall, an entirely warm and reasonable smile, which was, perhaps, the most unsettling thing about it. "For now," he said, "only your trust. I find it tends to be worth far more in the long run than anything I could take by force. Far beyond the wall, in a land where the sun rarely broke through gray cloud, and the wind carried the smell of old ice, the Night King stood motionless atop a ridge of frozen stone, and felt something the living would have called curiosity, if the dead were still capable of anything so warm as feeling at all. He had felt the tear in the world the night it opened, a disturbance in the deep, old magic that predated even his own making, a ripple spreading outward from the Kingswood like a stone dropped into still water. It was not fire he sensed in that ripple, though there was heat in it. It was not death exactly either, though something in its signature echoed with old, patient familiarity, the way his own magic did. New things had come into the world, things that were neither living men nor the dead, things he commanded, nor dragons, nor any magic his long unlife had yet encountered. And the Night King, who had spent 10,000 years patient beyond any mortal reckoning, found himself, for the first time in centuries, genuinely uncertain. He raised one pale hand, and the wind stilled around him as though the world itself was listening. Somewhere below the ridge, a white stirred at the gesture, rising jerkily from where it had lain dormant beneath the snow, milky eyes fixed toward the south, toward the wall, toward the Kingswood beyond it, toward the source of that strange new ripple in the world's old magic. The Night King did not move to march south. Not yet. He had learned, across 10,000 patient years, that haste belonged to the living, and he was no longer counted among them. Instead, he simply watched, the way a spider watches a single unfamiliar vibration on the edge of its web, deciding whether it signals prey or something far more dangerous than prey. And far to the south, in the quiet hours after his introduction to the Red Keep's lords, Aizen stood alone on a balcony overlooking the city, and felt faintly at the very edge of whatever senses had carried over into this new and unfamiliar shape. Something old and cold turned its attention toward him in return. He did not smile this time. For a long moment, he simply stood very still, considering the sensation with the careful attention of a man reevaluating a plan he had believed, until this moment, to be complete. "So," he murmured to no one at all, "there is something here worth being afraid of, after all." For the first time since the tear in the sky had opened, Aizen found himself genuinely, quietly intrigued. The war that would one day be spoken of in every corner of Westeros did not begin with armies. It began, as Aizen had always intended it to, with politics, a slow, patient game of whispered alliances and carefully placed favors that made kings and lords alike begin, without quite realizing it, to depend on the strange and powerful newcomers in their midst. He offered small things first. A company of soldiers ambushed by raiders beyond the Kingslands, saved by strangers in pale coats who asked for nothing in return but the friendship of the Lord whose men they'd rescued. A plague that struck a minor holdfast, halted within days by methods no maester could explain or replicate, though Unohana, the calm, dark-haired healer among them, made certain to explain enough that gratitude, rather than fear, took root in its place. A queen's private grief, quietly eased by conversations with a soft-spoken soul reaper named Ukitake, whose gentle patience made him, within weeks, one of the most trusted foreign faces in the capital. Piece by piece, favor by favor, Aizen wove his companions into the fabric of Westerosi power, never demanding, never threatening, always simply present at the exact moment they were needed, until half the great houses of the realm had begun to wonder, quietly and separately, whether they could afford to be on the wrong side of whatever Aizen ultimately wanted. Not every house welcomed them so readily. In Winterfell, Lord Stark remained watchful long after the southern lords had grown comfortable. "A man who gives so freely and asks for nothing," he said to Catelyn one evening, "is either the most generous soul the realm has ever known, or he is playing a game so long that none of us can yet see its shape." "And which do you believe him to be?" Catelyn asked. Ned did not answer for a long moment. "I believe," he said finally, "that I would rather prepare for the second and be wrong than trust the first and be wrong instead." It was this same caution that led him to receive, with far more suspicion than most lords managed, the quiet Soul Reaper captain who arrived at Winterfell's gates one gray morning, a tall woman with dark hair, calm eyes, and a manner so unnervingly gentle that even Ned's guards found themselves lowering their spears without quite deciding to. "I am called Unohana," she said, in answer to Ned's wary questions. "I understand your caution, Lord Stark. I would feel the same in your place. I ask nothing of you tonight, but the chance to speak plainly about what my companions and I are, about what Aizen intends, and about a threat gathering beyond your wall that I believe your maesters have long since stopped taking seriously." Ned's expression sharpened at that. "You know of the others." "I know," Unohana said quietly, "that something ancient beyond your wall has already felt our arrival and has already begun, in its own slow and patient way, to take notice of us. I do not believe that notice will remain patient forever, Lord Stark. And when it stops being patient, I do not believe your Night's Watch, brave as they are, will be enough to answer it alone. For the first time since the tear in the sky had opened above the Kingswood, Ned Stark found himself sitting across from one of the strangers, not with suspicion first, but with the cold, familiar weight of a warning he recognized in his bones, the same weight his father had carried, and his father's father before him, every time the old words of House Stark were spoken aloud. Winter is coming. He simply had not understood, until this moment, how much larger that winter might now become. The first true clash between the dead and the newcomers happened not by Aizen's design, but by the Night King's decision, a decision that came at last after months of patient, wordless observation. A ranging party from the Night's Watch, escorted at Ned Stark's quiet insistence by 3 of Aizen's Quincy, pushed further beyond the wall than any ranging had gone in a generation, searching for confirmation of the wildling reports that had grown more frequent, more frightened, and more consistent by the week. They found their confirmation in a valley thick with old snow, where the temperature dropped so suddenly that breath crystallized mid-exhale and torches guttered to embers despite no wind to explain it. The whites came first, dozens of them, shambling out of the tree line with the jerking, wrong-angled movement that no living thing possessed, milky eyes fixed on the living warmth ahead of them. The Night's Watch Rangers, veterans of 100 smaller skirmishes with the dead, formed up with the grim, practiced efficiency of men who had buried too many brothers to this same enemy before. It was the youngest of the 3, Quincy, present a boy who looked barely past his 14th year, though something ancient and unreadable sat behind his wide, watchful eyes, who moved first before any ranger could give the order to hold the line. Wonderful. The boy Okiora's quiet, unsettling companion. A strange child the others called, simply Nell, when she was not needed for battle. Though it was not Nell who fought this day, but a colder, older presence wearing something close to her shape murmured, almost to herself. I wondered what death looked like, in a world where death has forgotten how to stay still. Blue-white light bloomed along her raised hand, and the first wave of whites met a wall of concentrated spiritual fire that did what steel alone never could, not merely stopping the dead, but unmaking them, burning through whatever dark magic held their broken bodies upright until nothing remained but ash scattered across old snow. The Night's Watch Rangers stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring at a battlefield emptied of enemies faster than any of them had thought possible. But it was what happened next that truly changed the shape of the war to come. From the tree line beyond the valley, a presence stepped into the clearing that made every living man present feel, in his very marrow, an instinct honed by 10,000 years of humanity's oldest and most primal fear, the fear of the cold, the fear of the dark, the fear of a death that does not end. The Night King had come to see for himself. He did not attack. He simply stood at the valley's edge, pale and ancient and utterly still, and studied the boy-shaped thing that had unmade a dozen of his whites in the space of a single breath, studied her the way one old, patient predator studies another it has never before encountered, weighing the shape of a threat it cannot yet fully measure. "So," the girl said, tilting her head, entirely unafraid in a way that unsettled the watching rangers more than any display of power could have. "You're the thing Unohana warned the Wolf Lord about." The Night King said nothing. The dead do not need words to communicate intent, and his intent, in that long, silent moment, was unmistakable to everyone present. "I see you now. I will not forget this." Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned, and the wind carried him back into the frozen dark beyond the tree line, leaving the rangers and their strange, terrifying escort alone in a valley gone suddenly, deeply quiet. "We need to get word to Winterfell," one of the rangers finally managed, voice unsteady. "Now." The girl who was not quite Nell watched the empty tree line a moment longer, something old and thoughtful behind her wide eyes. Yes, she agreed softly. I think very soon everyone is going to need to know exactly what's coming. News of the valley, beyond the wall, reached King's Landing within a fortnight, and for the first time since his arrival, Aizen allowed the small council to see something other than calm, reasonable patience in his expression. You knew, Lord Varys said, watching him carefully across the council chamber. You knew what waited beyond that wall before any of us admitted it existed at all. I suspected? Aizen corrected gently. There is a considerable difference between suspicion and certainty, my lord, and I do not deal in unfounded claims. Now, however, we have certainty, and I believe it changes the calculation for all of us considerably. What calculation? The young king demanded, still unused to the weight of a crown that sat, in this telling, on shoulders too green to carry it comfortably. You speak in riddles, Aizen. Tell us plainly, what do you want? Aizen was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice had shifted not into anger, never into anger, but into something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Absolute, unshakable certainty. I want, he said, what I have always wanted. Since long before I ever arrived in your world, I want to stand at the summit of whatever exists above the world men and gods alike are permitted to see, and I have learned, across every world I have touched, that thrones such as yours are rarely the true summit at all, merely the tallest hill in a much larger country. He let that settle over the chamber like frost. Your Night King is not merely a threat to be defeated, my lords. He is a door, a very old, very patient door, standing between this world and something considerably larger. I did not come to Westeros to rule it. His calm, reasonable smile returned, and it was, in that moment, far more frightening than any anger could have been. I came because I sensed, long before I ever set foot in your Kingswood, that this world's oldest and coldest secret might finally answer a question I have been asking for far longer than any of you have been alive. The chamber went utterly silent. And what question is that? Varys asked quietly, dread already coiling in his chest at whatever answer might come. Aizen's smile did not waver. Whether death, he said softly, truly has a limit at all, or whether, given the right key, it can simply be walked through like any other door. Word of Aizen's true ambitions spread through Westeros not as rumor this time, but as confirmed, terrifying fact carried north by Unohana's own quiet warning to Winterfell, carried east and south by frightened lords who had trusted too readily and now scrambled to reconsider every favor they had accepted. He used us, Ned Stark said grimly, standing before a war council hastily assembled at Winterfell Lord's bannermen, a handful of Aizen's own companions who had chosen, for reasons of their own, to stand apart from their leader's ambitions, and even, astonishingly, envoys from the Night's Watch itself, desperate enough now to seek allies wherever they could be found. Every favor, every rescued village, every quiet kindness, all of it was simply building toward this. Not all of it, said a voice from the back of the hall, and every head turned toward Ulquoira, who had arrived at Winterfell 3 days prior with a small handful of others who no longer wished to serve Aizen's design. Some of us believed, at least at first, that his intentions were closer to what he claimed. I no longer believe that, and I did not survive the world we came from only to watch this one unmade the same way. Why should we trust you? A northern lord demanded. When you served him for however long you have, you should trust nothing I say, Ulquoira answered, flat and unbothered by the hostility in the hall. Trust instead what I am willing to do. Aizen intends to use the Night King's magic and whatever door it truly represents to reach beyond death itself. If he succeeds, I do not believe there will be a Westeros left worth ruling, nor a world beyond the wall left worth fearing. There will only be whatever Aizen decides to become next, and I have already watched that ambition unmake one world. I have no intention of watching it unmake a second. Ned studied the strange, pale-eyed man for a long moment, weighing a choice he had never imagined having to make an alliance not merely between houses, or even between kingdoms, but between the living world he had sworn to protect and a handful of defectors from a threat that had already proven itself capable of things no army in Westeros could match. Then we have a war on two fronts, he said finally, and precious little time to prepare for either. Far to the south, in the Red Keep's highest tower, Aizen stood once more upon his balcony, watching the distant northern horizon with the same calm, patient interest he had carried since the night the sky first tore open above the Kingswood. He was by now entirely aware that his true intentions had been discovered, aware too that several of his own companions had chosen to abandon his cause rather than follow it to whatever end he intended. None of it troubled him, if anything. The defection amused him faintly, the way a chess player might admire an opponent's unexpected but ultimately insufficient countermove. Let them gather their alliance, he murmured to the cold night air. Let them build their walls and count their swords and pray to whatever gods this world still believes are listening. His eyes drifted north, toward a wall he had never once needed to see with his own eyes to understand its true significance. I did not come this far, through this many worlds, to be stopped now by dragons and ice. Behind him, Haribel stepped quietly onto the balcony, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Aizen, Sama, the others who remain loyal await your command. Shall we move against Winterfell directly before their alliance can fully form? Aizen was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same unhurried patience he brought to every decision. No, he said finally. Let the alliance form. Let them gather every sword and dragon and desperate ally this world has left. His smile returned, calm and terrible and utterly certain. I would much rather they exhaust themselves against the Night King's army first, Haribel. It saves me the trouble of doing it myself, and it ensures that whatever door remains standing at the end of that war belongs at last entirely to me. Somewhere far to the north, beyond a wall built to hold back the oldest fear this world had ever known, the wind shifted and carried with it the first cold, patient whisper of a war that would soon consume every corner of the realm, a war that neither ice nor fire, neither dragon nor soul reaper, would be able to end quietly. The storm Aizen had spent months quietly building was, at last, ready to break.